The roar of the crowd was deafening. Madison Square Garden, June 1972. Just minutes before Elvis Presley was set to walk on stage for the biggest concert of his career, something happened backstage that froze him in place. A familiar figure appeared in the shadows: Priscilla, his estranged wife, the woman he still loved but couldn't trust, the mother of his child. She wasn't supposed to be there, not tonight, not when the world was watching. Elvis's face shifted in an instant. Shock, hurt, fury, longing. It was all there, flickering across his expression like a storm, and yet he didn't speak a word. He couldn't, because what she whispered in that moment cut deeper than any knife, leaving him with no choice but to step out into the spotlight carrying a secret that would follow him to his grave. The audience saw the king in his rhinestone glory, but those who stood close enough backstage saw a man unraveling, a man who had just been handed a truth so heavy it nearly crushed him before he even sang a note. That night didn't just decide the fate of a marriage. It exposed the cracks in Elvis's kingdom, cracks that threatened to swallow him whole. And the reason his face told the whole story was because some truths are too dangerous to say out loud. What Priscilla revealed that night would force Elvis into an impossible choice. Trust the woman who once vowed she'd never leave him, or believe the whispers that she had already betrayed him. He went on stage, he sang, he smiled. But every photograph from that performance holds a shadow, the shadow of a secret only he and Priscilla knew. And until his final breath, Elvis carried the weight of what she told him backstage. The real story of that night has never been fully told, until now. To understand why that backstage moment cut so deeply, you have to go back. Back to the beginning, when Elvis Presley was not yet the king of rock and roll, and Priscilla was just a young girl swept into a life she never asked for. They met in Germany when Elvis was stationed with the army and she was only 14 years old. He was already a global sensation, his records playing on radios across continents, his hips shaking on televisions that scandalized parents and electrified teenagers. Priscilla was quiet, wide-eyed, the daughter of a military officer. She never imagined that the man the whole world wanted would look at her like she was the only person in the room. But Elvis did. He saw in her a kind of innocence that fame had already stolen from him. For him, Priscilla became a symbol of something pure, untouched by the industry, untouched by betrayal. For her, Elvis was more than a star, he was a force of nature. Their relationship grew in secrecy at first, long phone calls, stolen moments, and a promise that one day she would join him in America. When she finally arrived at Graceland years later, still barely out of her teens, it was as if a fairy tale had come true. The king had chosen her. To the world, they were a picture-perfect couple. Elvis in his dazzling stage outfits, Priscilla at his side, elegant and composed, the silent queen of Graceland. Photographs showed them smiling, holding hands, surrounded by luxury, but behind the cameras, cracks were already forming. Elvis's fame was a double-edged sword. It gave him everything: wealth, adoration, power, but it also caged him. Every day was managed, scheduled, controlled. Every friendship filtered through loyalty tests. Every love strained under the weight of millions watching. And Priscilla felt that weight most of all. At first she tried to adapt. She played the role of dutiful wife, waiting at Graceland while Elvis toured, while women screamed his name, while temptation followed him everywhere. But loneliness grew. Nights stretched long and cold in that mansion while Elvis chased the stage, the studio, or the next escape from exhaustion. There were whispers even then. The Memphis Mafia, Elvis's loyal but meddling inner circle, noticed things. They saw how Priscilla's smile sometimes faded the moment Elvis looked away. They saw how Elvis, once so attentive, began to disappear into late-night rehearsals and pills meant to keep him going. But here the truth: despite all the cracks, despite all the tension, there was still love. A fierce love, complicated, messy, but real. Priscilla adored him, and Elvis, in his own flawed way, adored her, which is what made what happened later so devastating. Because the same love that bound them together also made betrayal cut twice as deep. By the early 70s, Elvis was at the height of his comeback. The '68 special had reignited his career. His Las Vegas shows were breaking records, and money was pouring in. To fans, he was invincible again. But inside Graceland, Elvis was changing. His nights stretched longer, his reliance on pills grew heavier, and the man who once laughed easily now carried a darkness in his eyes. Priscilla noticed it before anyone else. She noticed the late-night packing, the whispered conversations behind closed doors, the shadows creeping into his music. She also noticed something else. Elvis had begun to look at her differently, not always with love, but with suspicion, as though she knew something he didn't. And in a way, she did. Because by then, Priscilla had stumbled onto a truth she could never say out loud. Something hidden beneath contracts, whispered in late-night phone calls, woven into the fabric of Elvis's world by men who claimed to serve him. She couldn't tell him outright, not yet, not when his temper burned so hot, when his paranoia was already simmering. She had to choose her moment carefully. And that moment would come in June of 1972, backstage at Madison Square Garden. But in the months leading up to it, the signs were there. Elvis's mood swings grew sharper. His trust in Priscilla began to fray. He'd catch her on the phone and ask too many questions. He'd study her face for answers she wasn't ready to give. He loved her, but he feared her silence. And Priscilla, she carried the unbearable weight of knowing that her silence might one day save his life. Every love story has a breaking point. For Elvis and Priscilla, it was coming fast, hurtling toward them like a runaway train. And when it hit, it wouldn't just shatter a marriage. It would decide whether the king of rock and roll could survive the kingdom that was eating him alive. She was about to deliver a message that no wife should ever have to give. June 1972, New York City was electric with anticipation. Elvis Presley was about to perform 4 sold-out shows at Madison Square Garden, and the city hadn't seen anything like it. For fans, it was the King's triumphant return to the biggest stage in America. For Elvis, it was something far more complicated, because in the days leading up to that night, the shadows around him had started to close in. He was still on top, the most famous man in the room wherever he went. The rhinestone suits, the screaming crowds, the endless adoration. But behind the showmanship was a man unraveling. The pills were no longer a supplement, they were a survival tool. Sleep didn't come naturally anymore. Energy had to be manufactured, and every moment off stage carried the heavy silence of a marriage hanging by a thread. Word had spread through his inner circle that Priscilla was coming to the show. It made no sense. Their marriage was fragile, stretched thin by absence, temptation, and suspicion. They were no longer the golden couple the public believed them to be, but still, she was coming. Some of the boys whispered that she was coming to make peace, others that she was coming to start a war. Elvis couldn't decide which version he believed. The night of the concert, Madison Square Garden pulsed with expectation. Backstage, Elvis prepared in his usual way, packing, stretching, testing his voice. But underneath the routine was a storm of nerves. He wasn't nervous about the crowd. He wasn't nervous about the performance. He was nervous about her. Because when it came to Priscilla, the one person who knew the man behind the legend, there was no pretending. She could see through the rhinestones, through the charm, through the smile. And then it happened. Just before he was called to the stage, she appeared. No announcement, no warning. She simply walked into the dressing area, her presence cutting through the noise and chatter like a blade. For a moment, the room fell silent. Even his closest friends, men who had stood with him through bar fights and Vegas breakdowns, didn't know what to say. Elvis turned and their eyes locked. In that instant, everything else disappeared. It wasn't the crowd, the concert, the flashing cameras waiting just outside. It was just him and her. His face betrayed him before he could gather himself, shock first, then pain, then something darker. Priscilla stepped closer. She leaned in, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. The words she spoke were not words of affection. They weren't about reconciliation, or love, or even the child they shared. They were words meant to shake him to his core. Whatever she told him in that moment, Elvis didn't respond. He couldn't. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, and he turned away. But his face, that face everyone in the room could see, said everything. Seconds later, he was called to the stage. And just like that, the king transformed. He walked out smiling, strutting, feeding off the roar of the garden crowd. To the fans, he was untouchable, but inside, he was carrying the sting of her words like an open wound. And here, where the unraveling truly began. Because to understand what Priscilla whispered, we have to step back into the days and weeks before that night. Elvis had begun to sense that something was happening beyond his control. He noticed conversations that stopped when he entered the room. He noticed Priscilla's distance, the phone calls she ended too quickly, the nights she claimed to be with friends but wouldn't name names. His paranoia was building, and the more he tried to control it, the more it consumed him. Priscilla, for her part, wasn't distancing herself out of malice. She was carrying something she couldn't share directly, something about Colonel Parker, about Dr. Nick, about the way his empire was being run behind his back. She had heard things, seen things, pieces of a puzzle that suggested Elvis's future was being decided by men who didn't necessarily have his best interests at heart. But how do you tell Elvis Presley, a man whose pride was as sharp as his temper, that the people closest to him might be steering him toward disaster? How do you reveal a truth like that without breaking him? So she chose her moment. Backstage at Madison Square Garden, a moment when he couldn't escape, couldn't dismiss her, couldn't pretend not to hear. She whispered her warning, a message about betrayal, about plans being made in rooms he wasn't invited into. A warning that she believed could save his life. And Elvis's face told the whole story. He heard her, but he didn't know whether to believe her. On stage that night, he was magnificent. The crowd had no idea that only minutes earlier, he'd been hit with a truth so heavy it nearly buckled him. They saw the king in full command, his voice soaring, his hips moving, his charisma undimmed. But those who knew him best noticed the flickers of something else. The moments when his eyes drifted off, his smile faltered, his intensity sharpened. After the show, the whispers began again. His entourage traded theories. Some thought Priscilla had come to reconcile, others thought she had come to finish the marriage. But Elvis kept his silence. Whatever she had told him, he didn't repeat it. Not to Red West, not to Jerry Schilling, not even to his father. He carried it inside, a secret that deepened his suspicion and fueled his sleepless nights. Priscilla didn't stay long. She came backstage, delivered her message, and left. To some, it looked cold, almost cruel, but those who understood her knew it was something else, desperation. She wasn't there to win him back. She was there to wake him up. In the days that followed, Elvis's paranoia worsened. He replayed her words again and again, searching for meaning, searching for proof. He began questioning Parker more aggressively, demanding to see contracts, asking about money he'd never noticed before. He started confronting Dr. Nick about prescriptions, wanting to know why his body felt weaker despite the endless pills. And when he looked at Priscilla, when they spoke on the phone, he heard her warning echoing beneath every word. But here's the tragedy. Instead of drawing them closer, her attempt to save him pushed them further apart. Because Elvis couldn't decide if Priscilla had told him the truth, or if she was just another part of the betrayal. And that's where the unraveling truly began. A man who could command tens of thousands with a single note was suddenly powerless in his own life. A woman who had once been his safe harbor had become the storm. What Priscilla whispered backstage that night was meant to protect him, but for Elvis, it opened a door he couldn't close. It planted a seed of doubt so deep that every relationship, every friendship, every promise around him began to feel poisoned. And when he confronted her after the show, demanding answers, she didn't give him everything. She couldn't, not yet. She had to protect him in her own way. And so she gave him just enough to know something was wrong, but not enough to know what to do about it. That was the night Elvis Presley stepped into the garden as the king and walked out as a man who no longer trusted his kingdom. And from that moment on, nothing in his life would ever be the same. When Elvis walked off stage at Madison Square Garden, the roar of 20,000 people was still ringing in his ears. To the fans, it had been a triumph, a performance so powerful the New York Times called it historic. But backstage, away from the spotlights and the adoration, the real show was just beginning, because what Priscilla had whispered before he walked out there had planted a time bomb inside his chest. And once the music stopped, the ticking only grew louder. Back in the dressing room, Elvis dropped into a chair, sweat dripping from his hairline. his hands trembling with the come-down of adrenaline and pills. His boys crowded around, congratulating him, pouring drinks, laughing too loudly, but he wasn't listening. His eyes kept scanning the doorway, waiting for Priscilla. She hadn't stayed to watch. She hadn't returned after the show. She'd come, delivered her words, and disappeared into the New York night. That silence was worse than the message itself, because now he was left alone with it, replaying it in his head, hearing her warning over and over, each time twisting its meaning. He didn't tell the boys what she'd said. He couldn't, not yet, but his silence made them uneasy. Red West later admitted he knew something had happened because Elvis's expression that night wasn't exhaustion, it was betrayal. In the days that followed, the fallout began. Elvis's paranoia, already simmering, now boiled over. He started questioning everyone around him. Why was Colonel Parker pushing for new contracts without showing him the details? Why was Vernon handling money behind closed doors? Why did Dr. Nick always have a new bottle of pills ready, even when Elvis begged to cut back? Priscilla's warning had confirmed the suspicions that had been gnawing at him, but instead of clarity, it brought chaos. He couldn't decide who was lying, who was protecting him, or whether the only person telling him the truth was the very woman he no longer trusted. When he finally confronted Priscilla in private, the conversation cut deeper than any argument they'd ever had. Elvis demanded answers, demanded to know what she meant, who she'd been meeting, what she had heard. Priscilla didn't flinch. She told him just enough to keep him listening, but not enough to calm his rage. She said there were things happening behind his back, plans being made without his knowledge, people profiting from his decline. She told him she feared for him, not just for his career, but for his life. Elvis's reaction was split in two. Part of him wanted to believe her, wanted to cling to the idea that Priscilla was still the girl who'd once promised to stand by him against the world. But another part, the darker part, saw her words as confirmation of betrayal. If she knew so much, why hadn't she told him sooner? If she was protecting him, why was she sneaking around, making calls in secret, meeting strangers without his knowledge? The confrontation ended not with resolution, but with silence. Elvis walked away, unable to look at her, and from that night on, every glance between them carried the weight of that unfinished conversation. But the fallout didn't stop with their marriage. It spread into every corner of Elvis's world. On stage, he was still the king, but those closest to him saw the cracks widen. He pushed himself harder, his sets growing longer, his movements more intense, as if he could drown the whispers in the sound of his own music. Off stage, the paranoia gnawed at him. He began keeping notes, scribbling names, times, suspicions in the margins of hotel stationery. He'd wake in the middle of the night and call his friends, asking if they'd heard anything, if they'd noticed anything unusual. His trust in Colonel Parker began to fracture. For years, Parker had been his guiding force, the man who managed every contract, every tour, every decision. But now Elvis started asking questions Parker didn't want to answer. Where was the money going? Why were the insurance policies so high? Why was his health always being documented? Parker brushed it off, of course, but Elvis's eyes lingered on him with new suspicion. The same went for Dr. Nick. Once, Elvis had treated him like family. Now every pill, every injection felt like a test. Was this really medicine or something else? Elvis began refusing certain prescriptions, only to find new ones waiting in his room anyway. The more he tried to cut back, the deeper the dependency pulled him in. And every time he swallowed another pill, he wondered if he was saving himself or playing into someone else's plan. The fallout even reached Vernon, Elvis's own father, the man who had raised him, guided him, stood by him from the start. Suddenly, even Vernon's loyalty was in question. Money was being moved around in ways Elvis didn't understand. Papers were being signed without his approval. And Priscilla's warning that even family could be part of the scheme turned every father-son conversation into an interrogation cloaked as small talk. It was emotional whiplash. One day, Elvis would cling to Priscilla's words as proof that she still cared. The next, he'd convince himself she was the enemy, part of the very conspiracy she had tried to reveal. He loved her, he doubted her, he needed her, he pushed her away. The deeper he fell into this cycle, the more isolated he became. The boys around him noticed it. Jerry Schilling said Elvis started drifting into long silences, staring into the distance like he was listening to voices no one else could hear. Red West admitted he never seen Elvis so torn between rage and despair. And then came the second twist, the one no one expected. Because Priscilla hadn't just whispered a warning, she had proof. Documents, recordings, fragments of conversations she had gathered quietly, carefully, without anyone knowing. When she hinted to Elvis that she had evidence, his world spun again. Suddenly, it wasn't just suspicion. It wasn't just paranoia. It was real. But instead of relief, this revelation deepened the fallout, because proof meant danger. If Priscilla truly had evidence against the men who controlled Elvis's career, then her life was at risk as much as his. And the thought of losing her, even after everything, tore Elvis apart. He didn't know what to do. If he confronted Parker, he risked exposing Priscilla. If he exposed Dr. Nick, he risked losing the only man who could keep him functioning on stage. If he confronted Vernon, he risked shattering the bond between father and son forever. It was the impossible choice, and Elvis was paralyzed by it. From that point on, every step he took was shadowed by doubt. Every performance carried the weight of secrets. Every late-night conversation ended with unanswered questions. The king of rock and roll was still adored by millions, but behind the curtain, he was a man at war with himself, torn between love and suspicion, proof and paranoia, life and death. And as the summer of 1972 wore on, Elvis knew one thing for certain. The moment backstage at Madison Square Garden had changed everything. There was no going back. The woman who once represented innocence and purity was now the key to his survival or the nail in his coffin. What Elvis chose to believe about Priscilla would determine not only the future of their marriage, but the course of his final years. And the choice he made that night, to keep her words locked inside, to carry them like a secret wound, would haunt him until the very end. The summer of 1972 left a scar on Elvis Presley that never healed. He had faced thousands of crowds, millions of screaming fans, countless performances, but it wasn't the roar of an audience that haunted him. It was the quiet words whispered backstage, words that never left his mind. Priscilla's warning had split his world in two. On one side, there was the showman, still dazzling audiences, still carrying the title of king. On the other side was the man unraveling in silence, struggling to decide whether to trust the woman who had once been his entire world. The fallout of that choice shaped the rest of Elvis's life and his legacy. In the years that followed, the marriage dissolved. In 1973, Elvis and Priscilla finalized their divorce. The headlines made it sound simple: another celebrity split, another love story burned out in the glare of fame. But for those who knew the truth, the end of their marriage was far more complex, because it wasn't just infidelity or distance that drove them apart. It was the weight of secrets too dangerous to say out loud. Even after the divorce, Elvis never escaped the shadow of that night. Friends noticed how often he spoke of betrayal, how often he questioned loyalty. In interviews, he would talk about trust in vague, almost cryptic terms, as though he was circling around a truth too explosive to reveal. And Priscilla, though she rarely spoke about it, carried her own silence. She had tried to protect him, but in the end, her silence looked to the world like abandonment. As the 70s wore on, Elvis's decline became visible to everyone. The weight gain, the slurred speech, the unpredictable moods. Fans blamed the pills, the fame, the pressure. Few understood that beneath it all was the paranoia planted years earlier. Few realized that Elvis was living in the shadow of a choice he could never resolve. Had Priscilla betrayed him, or had she tried to save him? And then came the final twist, the one uncovered decades later, long after Elvis was gone. In the early 2000s, a researcher gained access to private documents connected to Elvis's estate. Hidden among financial records were references to insurance policies signed without Elvis's knowledge. Some bore Vernon's name, others were tied back to Colonel Parker. But alongside those documents was something even more startling: notes written in Priscilla's handwriting, documenting meetings, conversations, and details that matched the very warning she had whispered years before. It wasn't proof of betrayal, it was proof of protection. Priscilla had been keeping records, building a paper trail that could expose the conspiracy Elvis had only suspected. She had risked everything to gather evidence, to shield him from the men who profited from his decline. And yet, because of fear and silence, Elvis never fully understood what she had been doing. That revelation changes how we remember him. The king wasn't just a victim of his own excess. He wasn't just a man undone by pills and pressure. He was a man caught in a web spun by those closest to him, a man who doubted the only person still trying to save him. But the story doesn't end there, because there's another layer, a final twist that connects the past to the present. In 2022, a documentary team uncovered recordings Elvis had made in private late-night tapes where he spoke into a recorder, unburdening thoughts he couldn't share with anyone else. On one of those tapes, he talked about Madison Square Garden. His voice was tired, heavy, but clear. "She came to me," he said. "She told me something I wasn't ready to hear. I thought it was betrayal, but maybe it was love. I'll never know for sure. That's the part that kills me." Those words reveal the true tragedy. Elvis never got the closure he needed. He carried doubt like a wound that never closed. And because of that, he spiraled deeper into the very decline Priscilla had tried to prevent. Today, when we look back on Elvis Presley, we see the legend. The concerts, the jumpsuits, the screaming crowds. But behind it all was a man trapped between paranoia and trust, a man who faced the ultimate betrayal, not because he was deceived, but because he could no longer tell the difference between an enemy and a savior. And Priscilla, her silence has lasted decades. She never revealed the full extent of what she knew, never confirmed the details of the evidence she kept. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of grief, perhaps because some truths are too dangerous to set free. But in rare interviews, when she speaks of Elvis, there is a heaviness in her eyes, a sorrow that suggests she still carries the burden of secrets that could rewrite history. That is the legacy of that night in New York. A whispered warning that tore apart a marriage, shaped the king's final years, and left behind a mystery that still echoes 50 years later. Because Elvis's face did tell the whole story. His silence, his expression, his inability to answer Priscilla in that moment. It was the look of a man standing at the edge of truth, unable to decide whether it would save him or destroy him. And here's the final irony. The evidence Priscilla gathered still exists, locked away, protected, hidden in places only she can reach. Documents, recordings, fragments of the life they lived together. Evidence that could prove, once and for all, whether Elvis Presley was the victim of betrayal or the survivor of a plot even darker than anyone imagined. That's the last twist. The story isn't finished. The proof is still out there. And the silence around it ensures that Elvis's legacy will always carry that haunting question. Was he destroyed by those he trusted most, or was he saved, quietly, secretly, by the woman the world believed had abandoned him? The king left the stage for the last time in 1977, but the echoes of that backstage moment in 1972 never faded. Every story about his decline, every documentary about his death, every rumor about conspiracies and betrayal circles back to that night at Madison Square Garden. Because in those final seconds before the spotlight found him, Elvis looked into the eyes of the only person who could have saved him, and his face told the whole story. If the person you loved most whispered words that could change your life, but you weren't sure if they were saving you or betraying you, what would you do? Elvis carried that question to his grave. Tell me what you believe in the comments. I read every word.